Should a Christian marry someone much older or younger? And does God have a divine age limit written somewhere in Scripture that we've all been ignoring? Or is the judgment that age gap relationships receive in the church more about cultural conditioning than biblical truth? Age gaps in relationships stir up whispers, raised eyebrows, and unsolicited opinions, especially within the Christian community, where people feel qualified to comment on who you should love based on birth certificates rather than character. But what does the Bible actually say about marrying someone significantly older or younger than you? And more importantly, does God measure the validity of covenant love by counting the years between two people, or by examining the depth of their shared faith, mutual commitment, and Christ-centered foundation? Today we're diving deep into this controversial topic that makes religious people uncomfortable, separating cultural opinions that have no biblical basis from scriptural truth that actually governs Christian marriage, and discovering whether love truly knows no age in the eyes of God, or if we've been accepting man-made traditions as divine commands. Subscribe to Faith Ablaze Network and hit that notification bell immediately, because what I'm about to reveal will challenge everything you've heard about age gap relationships in church circles, and show you that the Bible's silence on this issue is actually significant, intentional, and liberating in ways that will transform how you evaluate relationships based on what actually matters for covenant marriage, rather than superficial measurements that have nothing to do with whether two people can build a God-honoring life together. The first truth that will shock most Christians is understanding that the Bible never explicitly forbids marriage between two people of different ages, and you can search from Genesis to Revelation without finding a single verse that says, "Thou shalt not marry someone 10 years older or younger than you," because Scripture is extremely specific about who believers shouldn't marry, commanding us not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers, according to 2 Corinthians 6:14, and prohibiting marriage to close relatives, according to Leviticus 18. But it remains completely silent on age differences, which means this silence is significant rather than accidental. When Scripture gives clear commands, we should follow them without question, but when it's silent on an issue, it often indicates freedom guided by wisdom and Christian principles, rather than legalistic restrictions based on human preferences or cultural norms, which means the absence of biblical prohibition against age gap marriage isn't a loophole that allows sin, but rather an indication that God cares more about the spiritual foundation of the relationship than the numerical difference between birth years. And this distinction matters profoundly because it shifts the conversation from "is this allowed?" to "is this wise?", which are two completely different questions requiring different frameworks for evaluation. The second powerful principle that transforms how we view age gap relationships is recognizing that the Bible provides clear criteria for healthy God-honoring marriage that apply to every Christian couple, regardless of their age. Difference, including mutual love and respect, shared faith, and deeply aligned values, genuine spiritual maturity rather than just chronological age, and a unified commitment to serve God together as partners in His kingdom purposes. These are the pillars of a strong marriage, according to Ephesians 5:22-3:3, which describes a covenant relationship as reflecting Christ's love for the church. And if a couple with a significant age gap possesses these essential elements, their age difference becomes secondary to the spiritual compatibility that actually determines whether the marriage will thrive or struggle under pressure. The real question isn't how many years separate two people, but rather are they both mature believers who are equally yoked spiritually, emotionally committed to Christ-centered marriage, and aligned in their vision for how they'll steward this covenant before God and the watching world. Because a couple who are the same age but exist at completely different stages of spiritual maturity will face far more challenges than a couple with a 10-year age gap, who share deep faith, compatible values, and unified life goals that make their age difference irrelevant compared to the strength of their spiritual foundation. The third biblical reality that most Christians ignore is how Scripture itself presents examples of age gap relationships that God blessed without recording any divine disapproval. Starting with Boaz and Ruth, whose story in the book of Ruth strongly implies a significant age difference, since Boaz refers to himself as an older man, and expresses surprise that Ruth would show interest in him while calling her "my daughter," in ways that suggest he viewed their age difference as notable. Yet their relationship becomes one of the most beautiful love stories in Scripture that God blessed so profoundly that they became ancestors of King David and ultimately of Jesus Christ himself, proving that their marriage was built on character, integrity, and faith, rather than compatible ages, because Boaz demonstrated godly character as a kinsman redeemer who protected Ruth, while Ruth showed noble character through loyalty and diligent work that had nothing to do with matching birth years, but everything to do with matching spiritual values. Another example is Abraham and Sarah, who, while closer in age, still conceived Isaac when Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90. According to Genesis 21-5, demonstrating that God's plan and blessing are unconfined by typical human timelines or cultural expectations about appropriate age ranges for life stages, including marriage and childbearing, and their story proves that when God is involved, age becomes just a number that cannot limit His purposes or prevent His miraculous intervention in relationships that align with His will. The fourth honest reality that requires wisdom is acknowledging that age gap relationships can present unique challenges that need honest discussion rather than naive dismissal. Because couples might exist in different life stages where one is starting career advancement while the other considers retirement planning. One might desire children while the other has already raised grown kids, and there can be legitimate differences in energy levels, cultural references, and life experiences that require intentional navigation through communication and grace. Friends and family might not understand the relationship and could become sources of pressure or criticism that test the couple's unity, which means these real challenges demand open conversation about practical issues like financial management, expectations for family life, how they'll navigate differing energy levels or health concerns as they age, and how they'll handle external judgment from people who don't understand their connection. These aren't reasons to automatically reject age gap relationships, but they are important topics requiring honest discussion bathed in prayer and biblical wisdom rather than romantic fantasy that ignores practical realities, because Proverbs 15:22 reminds us that plans fail for lack of counsel. But with many advisors they succeed, meaning couples should seek godly wisdom about these specific challenges rather than pretending they don't exist or assuming love alone will solve every practical difficulty that age differences might create over decades of marriage. The fifth crucial principle for evaluating any relationship, including those with age gaps, is focusing on heart condition rather than external factors. Because Proverbs 4:23 commands believers to guard their hearts above all else, since everything they do flows from it, which means when considering marriage with or without an age gap, the spiritual condition of each person's heart matters infinitely more than the year they were born. The essential questions should focus on character rather than chronology. Is this person demonstrating genuine integrity in how they live? Do they love the Lord with all their heart, soul, and mind, according to Matthew 22:37? Do they treat you with consistent love and respect that honors your dignity as God's image bearer? And do you share a common mission and kingdom purpose that unifies your lives beyond romantic feelings or physical attraction? Marriage is a covenant and a lifelong partnership, requiring a companion who will run the race of faith alongside you, while encouraging you and pointing you toward Christ. Through both mountaintop celebrations and valley seasons of testing, which means you need someone whose spiritual depth matches their professed commitment, rather than someone whose age happens to fall within a culturally acceptable range, but whose faith remains shallow, whose character shows inconsistency, or whose life priorities compete with, rather than complement your calling and purpose in God's kingdom. What ultimately determines whether a marriage with an age gap receives God's blessing are the same factors that determine any marriage's success. Is the foundation built on shared love for Jesus Christ that places Him as Lord over both individuals and their union? Is the relationship characterized by mutual love and respect and selfless service that reflects Philippians 2:3-4's instruction to consider others above yourselves? And are both individuals genuinely committed to honoring God with their lives and their relationship, rather than just using religious language to justify selfish desires or unhealthy dependency? If the answer to these questions is yes, then there is no biblical reason to believe that the number of years between them would create a barrier to God's blessing. Because 1 Samuel 16-7 reminds us that people look at outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart, meaning God is far more concerned with the spiritual foundation of your relationship than the age difference that preoccupies religious observers who lack biblical justification for their judgment. So if you're in relationship with significant age gap or considering one, don't be discouraged by cultural stereotypes or opinions of people whose theology is shaped more by tradition than Scripture, but instead, bring your relationship before the Lord in prayer, while examining your hearts and motives honestly, seeking wise biblical counsel from mature believers who can discern spiritual truth from cultural conditioning, and focusing on building relationship that is strong in the things that truly matter for covenant marriage, faith, character, and shared commitment to Christ. Because if your foundation is solid, your age is just a detail in the much bigger, beautiful story that God is writing, where love, in its truest, God-honoring form, is about far more than numbers, but about two people joining together to reflect Christ's love. 2. A watching world that desperately needs to see what authentic covenant commitment looks like when it's anchored in something eternal rather than temporary external factors that cannot sustain marriage through decades of challenges and changes. If this message transformed your perspective on age gap relationships, and you're ready to evaluate covenant love by biblical standards rather than cultural prejudice, subscribe to Faith Ablaze Network and hit that bell for truth that challenges religious traditions with scriptural authority. Comment what country you're watching from, and share this with someone who needs to know that God looks at the heart, not the birth certificate, when determining whether a marriage honors Him.